Developing your coaching eye. As a coach, it's probably the most critical and valuable tool to be able to see movement, understand what you're seeing, and then ultimately what to do with it. And so that's what we're going to be looking at with this entire presentation, not only from my perspective, but two other coaches in the industry as well. So before we cue, we must know where to look. And so often I think coaches get wrapped up in the cues. This is what I do for this movement pattern. But if we don't know where to even look, we could be cueing something that is completely inaccurate or missing something that would actually solve the issue that we are seeing with some other element. And that's why the coaching eye is so valuable. Oftentimes it's not what a basketball player per se is doing in the air towards the dunk. It is the third step before they even left the ground that matters. And so we need to be able to look at all of those elements. Or within a squat, it's not the knee cave that is the potential issue that we need to cue or even worry about. It may be some other element like the feet or something with the bar placement or the elbows, right? And so we're going to look and talk about all of those things. So first, I just want you to watch as you see this lady generic video, and just what are you seeing? Like, what comes to mind? What are you initially seeing? And ultimately, write that down, right? So, what is happening in this video? That's step one. So, if you need to pause this, please do so, but try and write down what it was that you saw. I know it was quick and I was talking throughout the entire thing. That was by design. Secondly, ask yourself, where do you think your eyes went first? And this is probably the most important thing. You saw this video, this snapshot, and probably only for about 10 seconds. You know she was doing a squat, or at least I would assume you're at that level. But where did your eyes go first? So you wrote down what was happening. You said it was a squat. And then you went to, well, where did my eyes go first? Where did I look at first within this image? Pause this if you need to, and then we're moving on. Where do your eyes go next? What was the second thing that you think you're focused on or you picked up on? Pause as needed, and then we're on to the last one. Where did your eyes go last? Pause again, write down whatever else you think that you might have seen. All right, now we're going to rewatch. So hopefully you actually did pause and write those things down because I find this part to be extremely valuable. So now we're going to rewatch. Again, we see this lady. She's doing a movement pattern. Again, part one was just to write down what it was you saw. And now we're actually probably paying attention to those things that we thought we picked up on, and we're seeing them with more repetition. We're seeing them throughout. And I can even play it one more time for us as we are going. There might even be more things that you're going to pick up on this as well. So we'll let this run. You can compare to your notes. Please don't change anything. And now we will officially compare to our notes. So what is happening in the video? And ultimately, you could write down a squat pattern. We are moving the center of mass by lowering it straight down and bringing it back straight on up. So it is a vertical displacement of center of mass, is ultimately the way we can kind of define a squat. So where did your eyes go first? Where did your eyes go second? Where did your eyes go third or last when we were looking at this second one? And we want to compare those two differences. So I encourage you to write down again how it looked after your brain was already pre-wired to be like, well, I know now what I need to look for because I now understand what the movement pattern is. So I find this to be extremely valuable. We're going to actually look at a pretty lengthy, deep dive from Coach Ethan, and he ultimately looks at it from these four elements. And I'm going to let him speak in depth about it. But he looks at the emotion. So do they look scared, confident, confused? They're trying hard. So ultimately, he's picking up on those kind of grimaces, those facial cues, that body tension that is happening. He's looking then at the movement. What are they doing? So first he's looking at the emotion of that lady that she's going up and down in that squat. And then he's looking at the movement pattern itself. So he's trying to gain more information about her before he even looks at the movement. And I think that's pretty fascinating and cool. And he's like, what are they supposed to be doing? So there's a preconceived model in his head of what this movement is and what that should look like. And we know that all models are wrong, but some are useful and helpful. And so what might optimal within that model look like? And then he's going to take it a step further and look at the anthropometrics. So like the limb lengths of that person, because optimal, and that's why this is in quotation marks for him here, what they're supposed to be doing may look different for someone with different ratios within those anthropometrics. And then he likes to take a top down or a bottom up type approach. So with upper body exercises, he usually looks from the top down. So he might look at the HJ, the glenohumeral junction, the shoulder junction. Then he's going to look down at the scapula, then how that's moving. Then he's going to look at the trunk. If he's looking at a lower body exercise, it's probably the foot he's going to start with, move up to the knee, to the pelvis, and then ultimately the spine. Let's let him take it away.
Hey there, it is Coach Ethan, making a video going over the coach's eye, and just wanted to give a little bit of a more in-depth analysis of what I put in terms of what I'm looking for when I'm modifying a client. So we've got 4 steps on here: emotion, movement, anthropometrics, top down, or bottoms up. A couple things I want to expand on are when I say emotion, it starts at the door. So when the client walks in, whatever space you're in, I'm looking at their facial expressions, I'm looking at their body language, looking at their eyes, see if they're droopy, see if they're closed. And I'm always checking in with the client. So emotion is a big part of what we do as a coach. And I think when it comes to our eye and making our clients feel as comfortable as possible, understanding their emotions and how your emotions are going to affect them, or how the gym's emotions are going to affect them in the culture, are going to be really important. So beyond anything else we do, I need to know if they look scared, if they look confused, exhausted, frustrated, tired, bored, if they walk in mopey, if they walk in amped up and ready to go. I want to be there and walk up and ask, like, how's your body feeling? How's your brain doing? What do we got going on today? And just get their general vibe. So I think, to me, that's probably the most important thing you can do in terms of connecting with your client, and then connecting with your client is going to transfer over. It's going to allow your coaching cues and what you see and what you can communicate to them to transfer over better, because they know that you're they feel seen, they feel understood, and you are taking into consideration their personal well-being, their emotions, whatever it is. You're trying to make this experience the best possible when it can be. Um, that then goes into movement. So once I've kind of got dialed in where my client is at, or clients are at, if I'm doing a larger session, there's a couple really important things when you are looking at someone. And I think the most important is what are they doing and what are they supposed to be doing? And to break those down a little bit more in depth, what are they doing is, I see them doing an exercise. In block specific example, I don't know exactly what exercise is on their app. Um, if you're the personal trainer, if you're doing a one-on-one, it's a little bit different. But if I see an exercise being done, and it doesn't pass the eye test, we'll just say for this example, I'm just going to make sure that we both know what the exercise is supposed to be. I need to make sure that we both have the context or the content correct. Because I could go over and see this and say, hey, what are you doing? I look down, it's like, oh, it's an exercise I didn't know, they didn't know. So I'm trying to get on the same page immediately. The other thing, these two go together, 1 and 2 on the movement, is that I want to give a cue, make a change that makes a difference in the correct direction. Obviously, not all of them, or not all of your coaching is going to do that, unfortunately. But the better we get at understanding what they're doing, how they're feeling, and our understanding of exercise, the better this is going to be. So, what are they supposed to be doing? Are they doing an exercise where my intended outcome, or the stimulus I'm trying to elicit in this person, is strength? Is it hypertrophy? Is it balance? Is it stability? What do I know about this person? What do I want them to get better at? What is the exercise trying to make them improve at? So, for example, if I have someone doing a dumbbell walking lunges, and I know how strong they are. Let's say they have a really, really strong back squat for their body weights, 2 times their body weight. And we're doing some accessory work with the legs, and I see them underloading. So they're doing walking lunges as their second exercise, and it's just not heavy enough. What are they supposed to be doing? Well, in this circumstance, they're supposed to be loading the movement, and I need them to load the movement more appropriately to the intended outcome we're looking for in the stimulus. So I need to get on board with what they're supposed to be doing, what the exercise is, and what our stimulus is. If I don't know those and I try to make corrections, or I'm looking, I don't have any content or context to look at to make a cue that's going to be meaningful. I could be adding stability to someone's exercise when the goal of the exercise in their plan, their mesocycle, is to work on stability. So if I have an exercise that is making it difficult for them to be stable, and I come in guns blazing and don't get the correct information and immediately add stability because they look a little unstable, I'm now taking away a stimulus response for stability. Because if something is difficult to stabilize while doing it, it is going to hopefully help you adapt to be more stable while doing that exercise. The transfer over would be you're more stable in life in general. Um, and the third thing, real quickly, once I have those two down quickly, what does optimal look like? Like if I had a textbook, if we had a perfect movement, I'm going to marry that with how they can move. So if I know the client really well and I see them performing an exercise, and the movement doesn't look textbook, but I know that they've got a shoulder range of motion issue that we haven't solved, working on, or won't be solved. It's a structural issue. Same with a squat, same with a hinge. And they're doing it optimal to what they can do. Great. Now I have to marry those two and see what's missing. Let's say they're doing a movement. Sorry, my eye itches. Let's say they're doing a movement that I know they have full range of motion in a joint, and they're just not doing it right. Okay, so that's what I'm looking at. I'm going to make um, I'm I'm not thinking about what I can address. On top of that movement, right after, sometimes before, 3 can be with number 1 on here. If you know your client really well, your anthropometrics are always there for you. You've seen them, you've worked with them, you're writing plans around that. So, but if you're walking up to someone, maybe they're a little new to the gym or you haven't seen them around much, I need to know their emotions, I need to know what movement they're doing, and then I'm looking at their physical body to start making some measurements with my brain. Are their femurs longer than their shin bones? Are they a really big rib cage, really short legs? Are they really tall legs, really small rib cage? Are they wide around the ribs or narrow? I'm trying to figure out how their body's positioned, how they like to move, how I've observed them moving, how I'm observing them moving, so that I can make adjustments to the movement that they are doing to elicit the response that I want. So anthropometrics are really important here. A quick example would be um, the one we've all seen is squatting. Joseph's got really long femurs, very long femurs, so his squats look a little more hingy than someone like myself who has much shorter femurs. Um, and I'm going to watch someone squat and check their ankles. Do they have good natural ankle mobility? I don't. I've got short femurs, not great ankle mobility. If I had short femurs and really good ankle mobility, my squats would be very vertical. But so for anthropometrics, I've got long femurs and bad ankle mobility, well, stiff ankles. My squat's going to look a whole lot different than Joseph's. I'll be a little hingier because my ankles can't get too far forward or my shins can't. But then there's people with really incredibly mobile ankles and mobile hips and proportionally sized femur to shin, and they can squat very straight down. So all of the anthropometrics of how their body is set up are going to change the leverages and the angles for their movements. Bench pressing is the same, where their hands need to be separated apart for their forearms and wrists, or elbows and wrists, to be lined up. People with longer arms have to be wider, shorter arms have to be closer. Overhead pressing, the size of their rib cage and their positioning, their mobility in the upper back. So I'm looking at all these things in their body on a quick glance sometimes to see what changes can I make for them to make this more comfortable, to make it more successful. And again, it goes back to this idea of like, we don't want to cue for the sake of cueing. We don't want to interrupt thought and exercise and focus just to get our cue out there because we want to be heard. We want them to be cues that make a difference for the client in a positive direction, for um, hitting their marks better, for PRing, for being safer, for all the things. We always want it to move in a positive, trend in a positive direction. Next would be top down or bottom up with upper body exercises. I'm going to start from which joint is being affected the most. And this kind of ties in with anthropometrics. So if they're doing a overhead press, seated or standing, I'll normally start at the joint that's producing the force to move the object we want. So if they're doing an overhead press, my shoulder's moving, my elbow's moving, my wrist is pretty stable, and my rib cage is moving and my shoulder blade. So everything in the upper trunk up here is going to be what I'm looking at first. Do they have the external rotation in their shoulder to get into the overhead position? Do they have the upper back, upper thoracic mobility to bring their chest up and move their shoulder blades around? Are their shoulder blades moving around? Do they know how to do that? Are they, completely tucked in and internally rotating the shoulders so they can't release from here and they get stuck in this position? So I'm looking top down to address quickly what is producing force, what is absorbing force in this situation, and is that in an optimal position for them to do so for what their body can do. So then we move to lower body. So for the upper body, I'm going to work top down, so neck, shoulders, elbows, wrists, the stuff that's moving up here, chest, back, and then I'm going to move my way down. So let's say I do my check marks and they're moving really well for their overhead press from the upper trunk down, and then I look down and their knees are locked out and their feet are really close together, or they're got a really aggressive anterior tilt because their thoracic spine doesn't have as much mobility, or they don't know how to access that mobility, so they're using their lower back to push up. So I'm going to work down quickly, quick check marks to make sure that they are in positions that I need them to be. Typically, just to go into a quick kind of like physics thing I'm normally thinking about when I'm looking at someone's exercise, is we always want to be producing force in a relatively straight line. And what I mean by that is if I'm pushing, let me get this as straight as possible. When I'm pushing, I want to be pushing directly against gravity. There's always a force coming against gravity. I guess, okay, there we go. There's always a force going opposite of gravity. There's a force that is gravity. We're trying to push directly against it. Now, if I'm overhead pressing in this position and I'm like this, I am pushing up and over. I want them to be pushing just directly into gravity. So I'm always making sure that whatever's producing force is producing it in a direct line against where gravity is trying to take the weight. Um, so for overhead pressing or bench pressing, any vertical or horizontal pushing, I want wrist relatively lined up with the elbow, because that tells me that I am pushing directly against gravity. Even better here, I've got now my shoulder, my wrist, and my elbow tucked in nice and tight, and I can get directly against gravity really quickly. My elbow doesn't lock out. Don't worry about that. Um, For squatting, it's a very similar thing. I am making sure the bar is directly over my midfoot where all the pressure is being pushed out of, so I can push directly against gravity. So that's just a quick thing I'm looking at if I'm top down or bottom up for lower body. Wherever the weight is, I want it to be lined up pretty close to straight with where we're producing force. Okay, so that's not the same for all exercises, but for a lot of these pushing exercises, if we're going against that, that is where I need to be. There's things that are outliers like hamstring, the leverages of curling and extending is a little bit different. So for pushing exercises primarily, that's what I'm looking at. Squatting's the same. RDLs are really similar. It's just the lever type changes. So then we are looking at type 1, type 2, and type 3 levers, which you can go look up, and that will be really informative to where leverage is in certain movements. And if you look up type 1, type 2, type 3 levers, you can then think about the body and where we have type 1, type 2, and type 3 levers. So next we go top down, or I'm sorry, bottom up, which would be lower body exercises. I am looking from the foot to the knee to the hip and then up. So for a squat, for example, I have a thing I like to think about and have taught a lot of people where if you're watching someone squat, imagine they have pressure lights under their foot. And if they are squatting and all the pressure's back on their heels, it's red around their heels. Or I'm sorry, it's red. Yeah, red around their heels, green nowhere else. If they're all in their toes, it's red around their toes. If they're on the sides, it's red around the sides. But if they keep their feet nice and stable, we're green lights all the way around. So I want equal pressure from the front, back, left to right of the foot. So we have that nice little tripod I'm sure we've heard about. We want even pressure on the foot. If I have even pressure on the foot, it means I can equally distribute the force through my legs down into the floor, which is what we're looking for. Then we move up to the knee. Foot positioning kind of dictates knee positioning, not always, but above and below are really important here. So I'm looking at knee positioning. If knee positioning is off, foot positioning is good. Now I go up to the hip and I'm looking at where those are. Are we too internally rotated? Are we too wide? Are we too externally rotated? Do I not know, but it doesn't look right? Sometimes it just doesn't pass the eye test, and I'll be honest, and all coaches will say this if they are willing to. Sometimes I don't know the right answer. Sometimes it just doesn't pass my eye test, and I can't figure it out on the spot. So I'm going to try a couple things to put them in a more optimal position, just to see if we can't, if I can't think this through and get them to work with me and with themselves to do so. Um, the last thing I'll say, just to reiterate the point I was making before, you're making cues to make a positive difference. That comes from an emotional level, a physical level, an understanding of the person you're working with, and then we need to dig down into the movement, the anthropometrics, and the joint alignment or centration. We need to separate, we need to understand both the person and the exercises and marry them together, because without the goals of the person, making cues to movements, you can get there, but what are you actually contributing to? If I don't know why someone's doing an exercise, what the outcome, what the point is, then where am I cueing to? If someone I know is trying to get stronger, they come to me, I write their plan for a powerlifting program, and I give them a 3x3 of bench press, and they are not giving it a good effort. Their form's bad. They're not paying attention. They're down in their luck. I now have an informed way to make a decision about how I cue them and how I talk to them. So to wrap this up, that's what I would say. I think the emotion part of this, your connection with the person, and your technical understanding will really give you a much better eye. Your emotional eye will really cue you into what directions you need to take in terms of their goals and their mood. And then we need to understand their body, how it moves, what optimal for them is, their anthropometrics, and then their joint centration or where their joints are lined up for the movements. Are they fighting directly against gravity? Do we have energy leaks? So that's my coaching eye. Thank you for listening. And as always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at any time, and happy to talk it through with you. Have a good one. Hey there, it is.
Sweet. So as we saw from Ethan, lots of good details there. You'll probably want to go back and listen to that. It went even deeper than just as far as what he's seeing, but why he's seeing it and where to look. But when he's talking about that foot up, that's what this is, right? He's looking at this foot ankle complex first. Secondly, he's looking at that joint centration, so how the joints align. So where is the knee tracking because of the foot? What is the shin or the tibia doing? Is it getting the external and internal rotation through the proper parts of the movement to make the appropriate shapes at the bottom and at the top? And then what is the hip doing because of that? He's also looking at not only that, but the emotions, the anthropometrics, and all of these elements that he talked about. So moving on, let's look at what Coach Day has to say. And so Coach Day, it's interesting, something very similar, but in a different order. She found that she looks at the anthropometrics first, an instant snapshot of the person's body for limb length and body structure to give her her ratios, which is going to create some judgment of what that image of that person should look like in those different shapes. It's that model. All models are wrong, some are useful. Then she's going to look at the face because that's going to determine whether she wants to intervene or not. Like, what does need to be happening here? And then she's going to look from a bottom up standpoint. The feet are everything for her, is what she's going to be talking about here in a minute. And then she's going to look for deficiencies. So she's basically from the bottom up as she's gained all this information, then she's going to zoom in and view things in isolation. So let's hear what Day has to say.
All right. Hey, everyone. So here is my little slideshow that Joseph put together, which is very pretty, of my four-step process of how I approach movement and my coaching eye. Before I get started with that, I do want to mention that if anyone's ever coached with me, they know that I'm a very minimalist cuer. So I'm not someone who's giving a lot of cues, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. I do think a lot of people are very unique in the way they move. And I go through this process in my head that we're going to talk about, but I also think about things like, is there movement? Does it have the intended stimulus? If I make a cue and they make this change, will it really benefit them? Am I taking away from the movement if I add this cue that actually is going to get them a little bit over focused on one thing and it's going to take away from the whole general, focus? So I just want to preface that because even though I'm a minimal cuer, I am going through a checklist in my head constantly, and I'm constantly looking at all these movements. So my lack of cueing or getting involved in changing things does not mean that I'm not thinking of these things and that I'm not going through this process constantly. With that being said, before I start here, a lot of people do like cueing. They do appreciate that. And I think that's why a lot of people pay for coaches, right? So, because they want that. So, it's definitely something I still need to work on a little bit more, realizing that that's what people want and kind of step out and, give the people what they want. So, yeah, let's start here. So, in the military, and it's not just the military, but this was introduced to me in the military, was the OODA loop, which is this decision-making model, right? And it's this loop, and they call it the OODA loop because it's observe, orient, decide, act. You observe, you orient yourself based on what you observed and the facts that you've gathered. You make a decision and you act on the decision, and then you start back from the top and go again. And that's exactly what coaching is. You're orienting yourself, you're observing, you're getting all the information from the person in front of you, whether it's a client, older person, younger person, athlete, non-athlete, whatever. You're observing everything of their movement and how they're doing, everything from their emotions to their actual movement and biomechanics. And then you're going to orient yourself. How are you going to approach this? They look pretty frustrated, so you're going to have to kind of handle that. And their movement looks like this, so you're going to have to, modify their movement this way and blah, blah, blah. So all these things are going in your head. Then you're going to make a decision. Okay, I see they're frustrated and their movement looks like crap. This is what I'm going to do to kind of make the situation as optimal as possible. And then you act on that decision. All right, you give them the cues, you talk to them, you kind of bring their emotions down a little bit, and you act on it. Now let's see how they move. So you're going back to the top again. You're observing their movement after you cue. So it's this constant circle, right? Constant circle. So that's exactly what I'm doing here with my coaching eye. It's like this constant loop of observing, orienting myself, deciding, acting, back to the top. So before someone even does a movement, I'm going to predict what I expect to see. And, sometimes it could be it may be like a little stereotypical because like if I see an older person, I'm just going to assume probably not going to move as well, right? And and then I'm also looking at their body proportions, their anthropometrics. Okay, this is their limb lengths as an absolutes and relative to each other. How does that impact the movement? And the classic example, which I see is written on the slide, is the femur to tibia ratio, which impacts how someone may move in the squat and their angle of their torso. So that's the classic example that we see, right? You'll see people who lean forward a lot in their squat and other people who are more upright. And I know the old school thought of squatting was that you had to be upright. So some people still have that drilled in their head and they're like, I lean forward too much. And, you're going to have to tell them like, hey, that's totally fine. Like that's how it that's normal for you, where, other people have a different situation. So I make those predictions as I see people, and I'm kind of saying like, okay, this is what I expect to see, and let's see how right my hypothesis was, or how incorrect my hypothesis was. So once you go through the movement, I'm observing, gathering information in my head. And the first thing I'm looking at is actually their facial feedback. And I think as a coach, as much as we want to believe that it's all about the science, the science, exercise physiology, and biomechanics that are involved in this, it's mostly about the emotions and being able to work with people. So it's not about your IQ, but it's about your EQ. So you're looking at the facial feedback and you're kind of seeing what their responses are. It's like, okay, they look like they may be in pain, which is not good. Let's have a conversation about that. Oh, they look pretty stoic. They're moving through. Cool. They look like they're on a mission here. I'm not going to bother that. They're in the zone. They're laughing because they're maybe frustrated, or they're just like, this movement's silly. Like, why am I doing whatever one-legged Bosu ball, split squat, pinky up, eyes closed, who knows? So I look at their face to kind of see what their emotion or feelings may be towards the movement, towards exercise, and if I need to make modifications by that, or if I need to just strike up conversation to kind of see, right? Like, let me see what they're feeling. And I see this a lot with let's say like single leg exercises, or any exercises that require a little bit more stability. As they're moving through, let's say they're doing a rear foot elevated split squat, and they're just like, I just can't do the movement. Like, and my balance, like, it feels fine. Like, I could do the movement, but it doesn't feel good because my balance, blah, blah, blah. And so that's where I start like thinking like, okay, what was the intent of having them do this movement? Was it because I wanted to challenge their balance? If that's the case, I'm going to keep it there, because it's like, yeah, you need to work on your balance. That's one of the focuses here that we're trying to build. Let's do that. There are other times where that's not the focus, and I want to challenge how much load they can handle, and I want to load that leg that's working, right? So if that's the case, and it's like, well, if you're so focused on trying to keep stable and you can't keep stable, so that means you're going to underload and you're not going to get the amount of muscular tension that I need you to get. And that's the point of this exercise right now, is I'm really trying to load you up in that single leg. And if balance is preventing you from doing that, then we're going to need to make a modification to make sure that you're more stable in the position and you can go heavier in load and actually work the stimulus that is intended. So, right, you kind of have to have those conversations and also those thoughts in your head as you're deciding like what cue you're going to give. So I think of that first, and then let's say I find out like whether I'm going to change the movement or not, or make a modification. Then I go into looking at how they're moving. Okay, so I usually start bottom up, so from the feet up, or top down depending on what the movement is. But let's say bottom up. Because not most, a good chunk of exercise is your feet is on the floor, right? They're on the floor. So I like to see what the feet are saying and then moving up the chain. So they're moving up the chain, right? And you could get a good story about that, how people move and how connected they are with their body. Or if you see like the body may not seem like it's communicating with each other, and it's like, oh my God. And you'll see this a lot maybe with like the hip trunk dissociation. Some people may be able to separate their trunk from their hip and move that, and other people just can't, right? And they just move everything together like they're a stiff board, and that's fine, because that gives you more information of how well their body moves and what they can do and cannot do. But those are the things that I encourage people to look at, is how the body communicates with each other. And if you're looking up the chain or from the top down, you're able to get that information. So you're able to get that clear picture of how the body's communicating with each other, where there may be some weak links in that chain that kind of lead to a deterioration of movement patterns and movement quality, movement efficiency. So I think that's really important. Yeah. And then like how it impacts everything. And then from there, so I made a prediction based on their based on age and what I'm seeing, limb length, anthropometrics. Then I'm looking at facial feedback, having conversations, maybe modifying exercises based on what I'm hearing or keeping it the same. And then I'm looking at their movement again, right? So I kind of, two and three are kind of at the same time. And I'm also looking at the movement and seeing like, okay, this is how this is how the chain's looking. Everything looks good here. That's where it looks weak. That's where it breaks down, or whatever. And then from there, you can give a lot of cues, right? If you see someone who's struggling with balance and they're telling you they're struggling with balance, and then you see them with running shoes, and you're like, okay, well, probably take off the shoes, right? That's gonna cause some impact there. You can see the foot shaking and kind of the squishy sole moving back and forth. Or you may actually see them, let's say they do it without the shoes, and you see that their foot is moving a lot and it's, just going back and forth. It's like, okay, they have no strength in their ankles there. It's very, very just loose, for lack of a better term. So maybe there's something going on there and other things they need to work on. Maybe I need to cue them here or give them this supplemental work or whatever it may be. And then deficiencies. Another thing too that I think that lead to movement breakdowns is deficiencies in strength relative to each other. So I'll use myself as an example because that's always the easiest for me. My squat is, I hate squatting. Barbell back squatting, like all other squats, I'm okay with, but back squatting in general, I'm someone, even though I'm short, I lean forward a lot because my femur to tibia ratio, my femurs are quite a bit longer actually in terms of ratios than my tibia, and that causes me to lean forward quite a bit, which again, unexpected because I'm so short, you would just assume that I can squat well. But beyond that, it's okay, right? Like I mentioned, it's okay if you're leaning forward. But beyond that, you'll notice that my hips rise first and then I come up. So it's like my low back takes over as I'm squatting. So I squat with a hip rise first and then up. And I think it feels fine for me. I've gone pretty heavy with that movement quality, even though I don't think it's of quality. So, although I do think it's fairly safe for me, and it's not like I'm reckless with that. It's definitely not a quality movement, and it actually doesn't get the intended stimulus that I want because at that point I'm working out my low back a lot more than I'm working out my legs. So there's that, and I think it's a puzzle, but I do think a big chunk of that puzzle has to do with weakness in my quads relative to my low back and my posterior chain. So my posterior chain's pretty good, and you can see that in the deadlifts and other movements that I do, like JHD hip extensions and those type of movements where I can go pretty heavy on those. But if you see me do a leg extension or some other quad isolation exercises, it's not impressive at all. It's very mediocre, and it kind of shows like, okay, like there is some type of imbalance here in terms of strength ratios that may lead to that weird pattern in her squat. And although, like I said, I think there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle there, that is something that I think that leads to that. So keeping that in mind as well is as you're thinking of these movements and giving out cues and looking, remember it's a loop like the OODA loop, and each time you go around the loop you're going to realize like, oh, that's also could be fixed, that also could be fixed, because it is a puzzle. There's always going to be something wrong, so be careful with that as well, because you can inundate people with a lot of information and cueing that you kind of just don't want to get into. So keeping that in mind. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. All right. Hey, everyone. So,
Cool. Coach Day, rocking it. So, as you know, she mentioned the foot, knee, and hips. She talked about those four things there. So, feel free to dive back in whenever needed to watch her presentation. So, for me, it's very similar, but also still a little bit different. I definitely look at the anthropometrics first. I literally am looking at an instant snapshot to try and give my brain some kind of context of why they are going to move the way that they move. And I'm looking at that same ratio that Day just talked about, the torso and femur. I don't do as detailed of a femur to tibia ratio. I'm literally just looking at, is their femur really long, and that's going to maybe change the way that they perform movement patterns, or is it really short? And that's going to change the way that they perform movement patterns. And then I'm looking at their torso from a standpoint of, if it's really long, then it's going to be pretty easy to keep their torso over their base of support, their center of mass over their base of support on something like a squat or a lunge. But it may be more challenging for them with something like a hinge. And so in my head, there is a model of what those movements are going to look like based on those understandings of those anthropometrics. There's also a relationship in my head on what injuries tend to occur or issues that somebody tends to have with those. So that's for another topic and another day. Not always going to be true, right? But it is a model that I work off of, and tend to see a lot of the same things there. The other thing that I really look at is rib cage. If I can get an understanding of, is this person a really broad chest? Do they have a really wide rib cage? Basically, is their infrasternal angle really wide? Is it really deep? Ooh, then we may have a little bit more lordosis in the back, the lower back, so that they're living in this extension position. That's going to change how they move. And it may mask some of the things that I'm seeing. I'm also looking, maybe it's more narrow, it's more rounded, and they're going to look more kyphotic in some natures. And so that may change some of the moves. So literally, I'm trying to analyze a person with my first look, looking across their body and trying to pick up those things instantly, regardless of whatever is happening in front of me. Then ultimately, I view it from a segmented lens. I'm looking at their foot as a complex. I'm looking at the middle body as the complex and the upper body as a complex. And I see them as all kind of individual parts. And those individual parts may play a role together, they may not. And so then that just really kind of helps me break it up. I see it as these three chunked up pieces when I'm looking at the body. And I'll show you that in just a second. But ultimately, that allows me to understand potentially why they are moving the way they are doing. So instead of just going foot and going on up, I honestly see three different component parts with them. Once I glance at that, the third thing I've noticed I always look at, if I'm looking at that hierarchy of those things where I said, what do you see first? First glance is my eyes are trying to figure out, like, what is this thing that is in front of me? Is it a long torso, short legged, long gorilla armed person? Or is it the opposite, right? Then I'm looking at them from a segment per point, because then that helps me figure out maybe what they're doing. Then I'm looking at facial feedback. So same thing that Dave kind of talked about. Like, I want to know if this is a movement I need to change, if they're working extra hard, because I may be able to just tell them to relax, just take a few breaths, and that could solve everything. And too quickly are we wanting to jump in and give different things back, when we can ultimately gain a lot from where they are at just with that position and that understanding. And then I zoom into the component parts. And so we'll talk about that. So if I were to just watch this video, this is what I'm seeing. And I know these frames don't move with them, but that's kind of how I look at it. Like, you've got this lower aspect, right? And so the foot complex, I'm looking to see, like, oh yeah, the toes are coming up here. You saw in that first movement where you see that foot actually deviates and rotates out a little bit. So that's kind of one area. But then I'm also looking at this other area of the pelvis. And so it's this kind of middle area. So I'm chunking these up as three separate but helpful component parts that are happening here. Did you have an anterior pelvic tilt? And then this thoracic spine, is it rounded? So my anthropometrics can honestly dictate a lot of what is happening within there. So I'm like, she's actually got decently long femurs, and a fairly like short torso in relation. It's a little bit, more moderate. It's not extreme, but we've got like a pretty high waist here, long femurs. And so naturally her butt shoots pretty far back in order to get that base of support, right? So that's just really helpful information for me. And maybe that's why that foot shoots back, and rotates out. And so I'm looking at the anthropometrics first. You can see her face is like really relaxed. That's where I definitely go second to get an idea. You can see even the smile and the smirk there that is happening. And then the next thing I'm looking at, I'm like, chunk, chunk, chunk. I'm like, okay, cool. And then from there, I can dive in deep. So once I looked at that initial thing, glanced at the anthropometrics, glanced at her face, then instantly from those 3 component parts, my eye went down to the foot because I saw this little thing that moved and it tweaked to the outside and I saw the toes lift. And then I went back up to my middle section. And I saw the actual anterior pelvic tilt here and then that kind of shift that is happening. So it's that kind of 3 components. So hopefully that helps. You have an idea of ultimately where to look from that coach's eye perspective. But knowing where to look is really only step one. It's the analytical part. And that all takes place the more you do it, the more you know what's happening. But now, what do you look for? And I started to allude to it. Ethan definitely dove in quite heavily to it. But that's really step number 2. And I think it comes down to 3 helpful things. 1 is the shapes, 2 are the patterns, and 3 are the paths that the bar will take. So when we look at shapes, we ultimately know that each movement pattern has kind of key shapes that it makes. So when we look at our example of a squatter here, we have the top position and it makes this very vertical shape. If you saw this person leaning forward, that shape in your mind of what this movement would look like doesn't add up. If we saw this shape of the base of a squat and we saw the butt way high in the air and the bar almost folded over completely beyond and the torso was parallel to the ground and in line with the kind of quadriceps and the femurs here, we'd be like, that shape is not correct. And it's not that it's a ultimately bad in all circumstances, it's just that it's not optimal based on what we know about the movement pattern. And so we do need to have a model of what that movement pattern is and the basics of shapes that those are. Then we can apply the understanding of those anthropometrics, as Ethan talked about how the differences are happening within a squat. So did Day. They both used that as an example, which made this slide very convenient. And ultimately, then we know where to kind of lead. So we have now our idea. We have our anthropometrics. We looked at our face. We looked at what our understanding of that movement was. And we saw some things maybe with the feet, with the hips, etc. But now we have some shapes to be able to understand. Ooh, this shape is off. We can also look at it from a more complex move, which would be, say, a clean and or a snatch here. And so with a barbell snatch, we have many different shapes that we know we need to see throughout. Ultimately, we have 7, but that can be really hard. And so sometimes you need to distill down, well, what are the most critical shapes? Like, which are the ones that are extremely valuable? And when we look at it, it's really the shapes that are most stable fundamentally. They're the ones where they shouldn't change. They shouldn't look any different based on the load that is on the bar. And ultimately, that's the same thing here. When we are looking at this, this is what the top shape should look like, regardless of what the bar weight is. This is about what the bottom of that shape should look like, no matter what the weight on that bar is. We should have the knees going forward in line with the toes. We should have the hips about parallel to the knees. Yes, they could be a little lower, determining what we're after. It could be a little higher. Torso could be a little bit more leaned forward or a little bit more vertical based on our anthropometrics. But ultimately, this is the top shape. This is the bottom shape. And I find that extremely helpful. So when we look at a snatch, our most stable that are not going to change and be fairly consistent regardless of the load of the bar is shape number 1. This very like hinged over, ready to launch. Shoulders are over the top of the bar. So the armpits are directly in line with the bar here so that we get that pattern. Then we have this like very vertical triple extension position that is happening. And then we have the catch. These positions, these other ones, 2, 4, 5, and 6, are going to change depending on those anthropometrics and the weight that's on the bar because of how fast that bar is moving and how quickly we need to get under it. But those are the most critical ones. So those are the ones we need to cue. Those are the ones we need to be able to dive into. And that's why this is very helpful, is to know what are my most critical shapes. All right. So once we have those understanding of the shapes, well, then we can look at, well, what are the patterns that are happening within them? And this is where having an understanding of biomechanics I find to be very helpful. So we know that our squat is a vertical center of mass drop and recovery. That's as simple as you can make it. Your center of mass is dropping down and you're recovering and coming back up. Those are our 2 shapes that are happening. And what is happening within those shapes? Well, we have hip extension at the top, knee extension, and at the bottom we have triple flexion. So this is what we're looking for. So if we lack enough hip flexion, well, then we may have the torso dump forward. If we lack enough ankle dorsiflexion, well, then we may not show enough knee flexion. So if we can kind of know what needs to happen at these different things from a pattern standpoint, well, now we're on to knowing where it is that we need to interject. Right? So this is where there's going to take some study and some deep dive. So let's look at the patterns here. Let's let you dive in deep as much as you want, because this is going to be expanded into next course level. But ultimately, we're looking at deep hip flexion between 40 to 60 degrees at the start, knee flexion, and now we have to be able to get some numbers on all these things, which is really helpful, right? Shoulders slightly behind the bar. We have like more of a checklist of what these patterns ultimately can look like, where things are deep, 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 and where they are minimal, right? So the last thing here, because now we've looked at, well, what are the shapes we're looking at? What are the patterns that need to happen? And then we can dive in and be like, ooh, this is the pattern that we actually need to work on. We're not getting triple extension through here. And this is what we can work on. And this is where we need to cue. Or we're seeing the foot rotate out, but we can ask ourselves, why? Why is it rotating it out? Or why are we not getting this? And this is the shapes and patterns. This is what this helps with. But the last thing is bar path. And I find this one to be the simplest and easiest for a lot of coaches to be able to dive into right away when you're first starting out. And ultimately, we have the bottom shape, the top shape, and we have the bar path that is happening. And so if we can watch, is that bar path extremely efficient? And usually the smallest deviation of bar path is going to be the highest level of skill that a person can demonstrate with that movement. And they're going to be able to move more weight. If that bar is deviating forward and shifting and going all over the place, yeah, then ultimately it's going to be less efficient. They're going to move less weight and ultimately get less results. And so we can then look at, well, where are we weak? Is it because we didn't gain enough hip flexion? So diving back into our pattern. And so the butt is staying high, or the butt is shooting up. And so we're not maintaining the center of mass over our base of support. Great. Now we know what to work on, but we also now have a metric of what to see. And so we need to understand what not only the shapes are within that movement pattern, we need to understand what the different patterns that are happening within that aspect. So the shapes, we need to understand the patterns, and then we need to understand the path. And we can look at how some paths are different. If we are doing a really good bench press, there's going to be a slight arc as the elbows come at a 45 degree and it hits the lower aspect of the sternum. The moment it's going vertical, we're probably pushing higher up into the actual shoulder girdle there, and we're missing the opportunity to expand through the chest. So the challenges with all of this is that it's going to just take time. It's going to take time. It's going to take practice. And so you're going to have to practice being aware. You're going to have to watch a lot of movement, but it starts with knowing, where does your eye go? And that's ultimately, if we go all the way back to the most important things, is asking what happened first in that video. Where did your eye go first? So identifying what the pattern was. Where did your eye go? Where did your eye go second? Where did your eye go last? So whether that's using the emotion, looking at the face, looking at all of those things, then looking at the movement and deciding from there the anthropometrics of that person, and truly learning what that is. And that's going to take some time. And then going with a top down or a bottom up. That could be a really good one. Maybe it's looking at the anthropometrics first, then going to the face, then going bottom up, and then looking for any kind of deficiencies based on the model that you have. Or whether it's like Days, anthropometrics, but then segmenting and trying to see them as individual parts of a whole. And the reason I find this one valuable is because if you ever get into the world of athletics, that's what running at any rate, change of direction, that's what all of that is. Looking for facial feedback and then zooming in. But all of these are really helpful to be able to look at a person, understand what might be happening that you're seeing, what their body might allow them to do, knowing where to zoom in. And then from there, if you can look to understand the shapes, the patterns, and the paths of those movements and dive in and really learn those, you'll be able to know where to cue best and get the result that you're after. All right, that's it. Hope it was helpful.